Thanks, everybody. Welcome to Build. I'm your host, Ricky Kemmler. Our next guests are the filmmakers behind the new HBO documentary series, McMillions, where, remember all those McDonald's games in the 90s? Well, turns out they were rigged. Please welcome writers, directors, and executive producers of McMillions, James Lee Hernandez and Brian Lazarte. Let's hear it.
Hello. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Let's start here, because I'm always fascinated with how documentaries filmmakers find their subjects, because there are multiple people that you could have started with here, right? Maybe you met someone randomly and it's like, it started spreading out for you in the same way that it did for the investigators. Who did you meet first, and how did you realize that you could start following through on this and untangling all of the web?
The first person we met was Mark Devereaux, who's the federal prosecutor of this entire case. And then after that, it was Tom Kinnear, who is the special agent in charge of the Jacksonville office, and Doug Matthews, who was the insane rookie who really spearheaded this investigation, as well as Chris Graham, who is the squad chief of the white-collar department of the Jacksonville office. But it actually started with not talking to anyone. It started with just doing research on our own, doing a Freedom of Information request with the government, and then getting permission to reach out to these people.
How did you hear about this case?
James did.
Yeah, I was laying in bed on cruising through Reddit before I fell asleep one night. Just
Great way to fall asleep.
Oh yeah, looking at like funny videos and things. And there was a TIL. Today I learned nobody really won the McDonald's Monopoly game, and I loved that game as a kid, so I tapped on it, and it was just a really short local Jacksonville newspaper blurb about it, and then I dove in from there, and then it took about a little over 3 years for the Freedom of Information request to go through the government, and that's when in 2017, Brian and I linked up and dove into this thing together.
So you dive into this thing together, that's when you start doing interviews, you start sort of seeking people out. And how long was that process? I mean, 2017, you started, it seems it's a fairly quick process in terms of getting all of these people together for these interviews.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's still 3 years, from today, right? So you
Like
can
it was
say
yesterday.
We always looked at this as, okay, how big is this? At that time when we first met for lunch, and James was telling me that, hey, I filed this Freedom of Information request with the government. It took 3 years. I've now been in touch with some of the federal agents. Like, okay, well, that's cool. It's a cool story on the surface. No one really had a chance to win the McDonald's Monopoly game, but are they good storytellers? Is there enough to warrant pursuing this as either a documentary feature, which is what we were thinking at the time, and then as we were talking to some of the quote-unquote winners who were ultimately indicted by phone, many who didn't want to go on camera at first and ultimately did for us, some of the attorneys, defense attorneys, prosecutors, and even McDonald's, we realized just how expansive this was. There was no way we could do justice to the story to try to squeeze it into a 90-minute documentary. And that's when we teamed up with Unrealistic Ideas, which is Mark Wahlberg, Stephen Levinson, Archie Gibbs's unscripted company, and we brought it to HBO. And James and I don't come from a long history of directing documentaries and features and stuff like that. This was really one of our first big opportunities, and having Mark Wahlberg and Stephen Levinson actually at our backs, with Archie Gibbs supporting us, really helped build that trust with HBO to allow us to pursue the vision that we had for the story.
So you get to this place where clearly there are far too many characters for a simple feature-length documentary. What do you think you would have lost in terms of what you said about those characters if it was only 90 minutes long?
You'd lose quite a bit of. Well, there are very important things that happen within this entire case and this entire story that normally would just hit a cutting room floor. And it's really the relationships within the people that were working this case. And by working, I mean the FBI side of it. It's pretty easy to show that portion of it, but the relationships of how these individuals got roped into being winners, quote unquote, that's the stuff that really would have been missing. For example, in this last episode, for episode 3, the relationship between Robin Colombo and Gloria Brown is something that you really wouldn't have the time to dive into. And also with Gloria Brown's story, you start thinking one thing about her at the beginning of the episode, and at the end, you understand it's it's far more serious and far more tragic than you originally see. And those are the things that you really wouldn't be able to, or we would not be able to investigate and really show everyone the full range of someone's personality.
Right, you wouldn't really be able to tease out the idea of her and sort of draw the audience in and make them kind of complicit in a judgment and then pull the rug out from underneath them.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, there's also just character overload. If we were trying to fit this all into a 90-minute feature, and you could say on the surface, if you know anything about the story, like, yeah, you could fit it into a 10-minute story. Guy steals game pieces from McDonald's and sells them to friends and family, who then sell them off to other friends and family, and they all get away with the scam for 12 years until they get busted by the FBI. But that's not the storytelling that we were interested in diving into, and you can't fit all of these characters into a 90-minute movie. Like, people would just, you'd be character overload. Being able to dole it out over the course of a series allows us to spend far more time, invested in the process. We were very curious as to how the FBI investigated this, their brainstorming sessions, how they came up with, the seed of the information. If you've seen now episode 1, like, this rookie agent saw this Post-it note on his, superior special agent's desk that said McDonald's monopoly fraud. And, who knows how long it had been there. And, the idea that it could trigger from the curiosity of one agent to then say, hey, let's go undercover. Let's pose as a film crew to go to some of these winners' houses, like Publishers Clearinghouse style. All the efforts that they went through to discover and uncover what they did was extremely fascinating. We wouldn't have had that time in just a feature to explore that.
They did the film crew twice, right? Or was it just once, and then they did the reunion thing, which just contained a film crew within it, but it wasn't the same sort of Shamrock Productions?
Right. So the very first version of it was the Publishers Clearinghouse style of, we're going to show up at the most recent winner's home. This guy just claimed $1 million winning game piece. And we're going to come there and we're going to film him with the big check and make this big exciting thing out of it, like it's going to be in a McDonald's commercial. But then the FBI had to figure out, well, how do we have winners from the past tell their stories? We can't just show up at their house randomly because they had won maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago. So that's where they hatched this idea of, all right, well, let's say we're doing a reunion of winners, and then we're going to do these interviews to play at this reunion and be part of this big celebration. And so that was the different setup for these interviews.
And they found that how many of the winners were willing to come talk to them at that time?
Well, as the FBI looks at any case, it's always about just building and building. There were several that they went to. They went to their houses, and then they set up shop in a hotel for this reunion of winners ruse, where they were posing as a McDonald's reunion event that they were trying to put together in Vegas, and wanted to get their stories on tape to show on the big screen and make this whole buffet event out of. But at a certain point, they had enough, right? Once the FBI had enough evidence to take this to trial, that's when they made their arrests.
Right. Let's backtrack a little bit, because I feel like I did this, but I've gotten in the weeds with what happens in the documentary. I mean, this essentially, McDonald's has a monopoly game, and nobody is actually winning. Somebody else is doing it. How much do you want to say before people see it of what actually was happening there? Because I don't know how much you want to give away.
Well, so the game started in 1987, and from 1989 to 2001, that was the bulk of this crime. In 2001 is when the FBI gets involved and ultimately takes this down. But there were people that were winning. So that was the thing. Like, to McDonald's, it looked like the game was working because there were actual winners, and so they didn't really suspect anything. But the game worked how it would normally work. You collect all the game pieces. You try to get Park Place, and then Boardwalk was the $1 million winning game piece, and that was always the one that's impossible to find. And what was happening was this main person was finding recruiters, and then those recruiters were finding the people who would actually win and redeem the pieces. They just had to pay money up front for them.
How much did they pay?
It depended on during the time period and the person, the actual recruiter you're dealing with, usually around $50,000 to $100,000 for the $1 million winner.
I mean, that's a pretty good crime.
Well, I mean, you know, if you're invested, if you're paying that kind of money, chances are you're not going to, you know, admit that you're a part of it. Also, everyone wanted to win, right? If you played the game in the 90s, there isn't a single person who said that if a friend or family member came to them and said, "Hey, if you claim this game piece, just say you're the one who took it off the fry box or the drink cup and tell a little white lie," everybody would have done it, or most people would have.
I told you in the green room, I think I'd still do it if I was.
We did a screening at one point, and we just posed the question to the audience, how many people would have done it? And it was more than half of the people that raised their hands. I mean,
And the other half were liars.
yeah, yes, because if you think about it, it seems like a victimless crime. Somebody already has to win. McDonald's is a multi-billion-dollar company. So what is it going to matter? It's not like you have to rob a bank or kill somebody or anything like that. All you're doing is basically telling a little white lie.
But as you've said, this wasn't a victimless crime, right?
No, I mean, the effect that this had, not only on those who participated and claimed those game pieces, but the fallout, you know, the jobs that were lost, you know, people who were directly associated with, you know, making the game pieces, fry boxes, the marketing company, everybody who participated has been affected. The friendships, the relationships, the work opportunities. Once you're a federal criminal, you know, it changes how employers might look at you. So it's had a dramatic effect on everybody's life who was, you know, touched by this in some way.
You know, I said this in the green room. I don't think I've seen a documentary move this kinetically, this quickly, as since like Cocaine Cowboys, which is kind of a touchstone, I think, of sort of like comic crime caper docs. What were you guys thinking when you went into the editing room? Did you know, because of the footage and how you shot it, the way that you wanted to edit it, or were you sort of looking at the footage and figuring it out as you went along?
It was one of those things that at the very beginning, you look at the story and you, like we just talked about, it wasn't about a mass murder. It wasn't about someone being wrongfully accused for 35 years and in prison. It's inherently kind of a quirky story, just on the surface. And then we started to meet all of the people involved, and you have someone like Doug Matthews, you have someone like Robin Colombo and Frank Colombo, and you have these personalities that are just atypical of what you would normally think. I mean, when you think about the FBI, you think boring people in suits, no personality, and then you meet someone like Doug and even Chris Grant.
Gold suit.
Yeah, you don't think gold suit, although he had a white shirt on, so we thought he was good. Right. So we saw that and we thought, all right, well, this is far more interesting, and we wanted to keep it more like real life. Real life can be funny in one instance and tragic in the next, and so we just wanted to ride that line of not making fun of the people that are in it, not making fun of the characters that tell the story, but letting them be fun and be funny.
What were you most surprised by while you were filming it, or when you were investigating it?
You know, people ask us that question all the time, and there's so many surprises throughout the series. Just the twists and turns that, like, if you were writing a screenplay, you would never even think of all the different things that actually happened, not only to the FBI, but those who participated in the crime scheme, even from, you know, McDonald's. So, you know, McDonald's sent one of their people undercover with the FBI, you know, to these people's houses. You know, Doug Matthews, who was the rookie agent at the time, showing up in a gold suit. Yes, that, you know, was a tremendous surprise. But, you know, some of the characters like Gloria Brown, who's in episode 3, as you mentioned before, you see her in the FBI footage, you might think one thing about who this person is and pass judgment. But when you hear her story and you realize what she went through, that was a great surprise. There's a lot of incredible surprises also coming up. We don't want to spoil it yet in episodes 4, 5, and 6. So, I mean, at every instance, you know, whenever we went and did a new interview for this, we would find ourselves, you know, wondering, like, how in the world are we going to, you know, tie this into the bigger picture? Because we would shock ourselves, or we would, you know, find ourselves asking each other, like, did this really happen? And then having to like corroborate it with other people. Like,
there's fascinating things that happen. Even in episode 5, when you think everything's done and the FBI has finished their job, there's a massive boneheaded thing that happens that you won't believe that happens within a government entity that almost takes the whole thing down.
there's a lot that we couldn't fit into the series. We're doing the companion podcast to the series, which is just talking about things in the episode, playing some of the deleted scenes, doing some interviews with some of our subjects to talk further and further detail, because we love this story. We definitely have been living, breathing, sleeping it for
and eating way too much McDonald's since we started working on it.
Were you really?
True.
Would you find that while you were cutting it, you'd be like, all right, that looks pretty good. Let's go get some fries?
Basically, well, when we were on the road doing interviews, we were in the South quite a bit, and it would start off with, okay, let's all
research.
meet. Yeah, let's meet all at this location, and then we'll go to the location of the interview, and then we'll be like, oh, there's a McDonald's. Let's just meet there. And then you're sitting in the parking lot at McDonald's, and you're like, why don't we just get some French fries while we're waiting here? And that rolls into a quarter pounder of cheese. And
were you surprised at how much the agents love being undercover? Like, the agents seemed to relish and loved the opportunity to go undercover and to trick people.
Yeah, well, with Doug Matthews, in general, undercover, as cool as it sounds, talking to the FBI agents that have done this, and especially Agent Pelliciotti, who is the head of undercover at Jacksonville, she describes it. It's like acting, but you can actually really get hurt. Mm-hmm. Like, there's guns and weapons, and you don't know what you're walking into. But all of us probably have that sort of fantasy in our mind of what we wish undercover would be, and that's exactly what Doug Matthews is like. He just wanted that. What he thought of, what it would be like in the movies. Oh my God, this would be so fun.
Well, that's kind of what they got with this particular case, right? Like, most other cases, like going undercover with like the Hells Angels or a drug gang of some kind, I'm sure is just like terrifying. But with this one, it was like, we get to pretend to be a film crew and like dupe these people who duped this process.
You got to remember, this is white collar, right? So all these agents who are working white collar cases were looking at healthcare fraud. Many of the agents, like Doug Matthews, were accountants who had been recruited by the FBI because the FBI needed people who could look through bank ledgers and find criminal activity in numbers. Rarely did they have a chance to pursue things in an active investigation like this, right? So it was often talked about like a drug case, where you have a product that's moving, you have people who are selling it for a certain price, who are stealing it from within an organization, and that was extremely fascinating, obviously, to someone who's been a button pusher, but someone who's been looking at numbers day in and day out. He was doing healthcare fraud cases for, Doug Matthews was a rookie at the time, but his senior agent, Rick Dent, they've been focused on that for years. And so, this was an opportunity to go undercover when, usually there isn't one.
Little did the FBI know that they got, when they pulled an accountant on, that they got like a Johnny Utah there. Like a Point Break style accountant. We have time for a couple questions. The first one is from Mason, right here.
Hi, guys. I just wanted to ask, in the first episode, you mentioned that Rick Dent didn't want to participate. He sort of gave you guys that very terse no. So who actually in the docu-series was the hardest to get to participate on camera?
Definitely McDonald's. Even though there are multiple people in this that were part of the crime, and you think like, okay, for the FBI, it's really easy. This is part of their job. They normally don't get to talk about anything that they do within their job, and this is something they actually can be proud of and talk about. The criminal side, this is probably one of the worst things that's happened to them in their entire life. And so they were difficult, but McDonald's took about 18 months to get on board because their brand is everything to them. And normally documentaries that involve McDonald's don't paint them in the best light. And we assured them, we went to their headquarters and said, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get to the truth of what happened with this story. And we want to tell all the sides, and you are a major side of this, and we would love for you to tell your story. And Rick Dent, we did talk to quite a bit. He just didn't want to go on camera because he's retired and doesn't want to be thought of as an FBI agent forever.
He does answer questions. Yes, no, don't recall though. So we were accurate in depicting that.
One more from Alec. Right here.
Hi. So do either of you remember watching any documentaries growing up that led you to want to make this sort of work?
You know, we always look at, I mean, both of us love movies. We love a good story. I mean, when we talk about what kind of look, obviously like Coen Brothers films, Soderbergh, Scorsese, like all the greats are, the filmmakers that really inspire us because they're great storytellers. The documentary form has evolved in the last, especially the last 5-10 years, but we've gotten to the point now where we can tell sophisticated stories over the course of 6 hours. That opportunity wasn't around as much back in the day, and we wanted to tell a story that was fun, that you could laugh at or think on the surface was just this seemingly victimless crime, but at the heart of it, did have, a great effect. And as James was saying before, it doesn't involve, it's not a true crime story where there's murder and it's depressing, or we're not trying to change, push the needle on an issue in this documentary. We're just trying to tell an entertaining story, and for those of us who especially were alive in the 90s and recall this nostalgic decade of going to McDonald's and trying to win these game pieces, to pull the curtain back and say, hey, this whole thing was a lie. That's a fascinating thing. It makes you wonder, like, what else, what were we tricked about, in our life growing up?
A lot, especially in the 90s.
Right?
Yeah.
We had to have been.
Yeah.
Guys, I love the series. Congratulations. It's airing on
thank you.
HBO right now. What nights is it?
It's Monday nights at 10 p.m.
But I have to be honest with you, I was in a hotel this past weekend and it was on HBO literally all weekend. Like whichever HBO channel, like of the 4, it would be on one of them at a certain point.
That's literally what it's like at my parents' house right now. My mom hasn't turned the TV off HBO just in case it comes on.
Well, congratulations, guys. Everybody give James and Brian a huge round of applause for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, guys.